framework of Weberian rationality. Even more recently, last year, in 2016, in his monograph Legible Religion, Duncan McRae interprets Cicero's De Legibus as part of a wider discourse of what he calls civil theology, the main attempts of which was to systematize Roman religious culture. In his opinion, the second book of the De Legibus produced, and I quote, a selective textualized version of Roman religious practice, a end of quote, product of the competitive intellectual world of the elite of the late Republic. However, when set in the wider intellectual trends, certain peculiar traits of the Ciceronian endeavor are lost from sight, and Cicero's overall project may be reduced to be interpreted, in McRae's words, to be both parochially Roman and substantially traditional. But Greg Wolfe, recently commenting on a short introduction which I wrote with Fiacre McRyan on Varro, asked me an important question. By reading Cicero's and Varro's works as responding to the contemporary crisis of neglect and ignorance that they portray, are we not falling into the trap that they themselves have built for us, designed to obscure their true intellectual and political program? Keeping that question in mind, let's turn to the actual text, the Cicero's text. So, although the first book, Concerning the Principle of Natural Law, has often been considered at odds with the religious and civil war codes of Book 2 and 3, recent studies by Francesca Fontanella in 2012 and Jet Atkins in 2013 have convincingly argued for a more integrated reading of the three books. In their interpretation, the codes of religious and public laws aim to apply the injunctions of natural law of Book 1 to human life, even if, as Atkins notes, the very act of applying the natural law leads to modification to the original principle. In reading the religious laws, the book seems to cover a rather wide and interesting set of topics, which are so broadly organized. So I give you an outline of the actual second book of religious laws. There is, at the start, there is a law concerning the manner of approach to the gods. Then this is followed by a law on licit gods and their shrines, followed by a section on sacred rites, then a treatment of priests, and finally, the law code ends with a rather puzzling collection of miscellaneous provisions, which include a variety of laws from the prohibitions of women's nocturnal festivals to restrictions on offering of alms to the penalty for the theft of property under divine custody. All of these laws are followed by a commentary, which, however, is not uniform, as it omits, as sometimes it might omit a law altogether, as in the case of the laws concerning sacra privata or the Dei Mani, or at times instead extensively analyze another law, as in the case of the Augurs, or even indulge in lengthy digressions. It is rather interesting that Cicero wishes to underline that these laws are very much in line with Roman tradition. He has his brother Quintus to comment that the religious system that he had just proposed does not differ a great deal from the laws of Numa, he says, and our own customs. He carries on explaining that since his laws are meant to establish the mixed and balanced constitution that Cicero had described in the De Republica, if he seems to introduce some new provisions previously unknown to Rome, these have their foundation in the mos maiorum, in the traditions of the ancestors, which used to have the binding force of law. It is therefore tradition, with its antiquity, that grants legitimacy to Cicero's legislative innovations. It becomes therefore intriguing, and as we shall see, I think revealing, to consider these very new laws that Cicero had introduced in the religious law code. These laws can be grouped in two broad categories. So these are the laws that really Cicero inserts in the law code as opposed to those that really are in line with what was happening at the time in Rome. The first group includes provision against improper kinds of music, against the consecration of arable land, provisions imposing limits on offerings of alms, as well as on expenditure for funerals and tombs. The second group concerns mainly the administration of capital punishment against those who do not comply by the Augurs' findings, and those concerning the treatment of people who commit a sacrilege. As Dyke has shown, many of these innovative laws have some precedence in the Greco-Roman tradition, either as parallel in Plato or in Greek legislation, or even in early Roman practices, later abandoned by Rome. However, amongst these laws, there is one that truly stands out as remarkably dependent on the Roman context, and this is the law concerning the Augurs, and it is therefore on this law that I would like now to concentrate. After a brief mention of the Pontifices, the Flamines, and the Vestal Virgins, Cicero explains that those who hold the knowledge of the methods and rites suitable to private and public sacrifices are three main groups of priests, so those presiding the rituals, the aruspices, and the augurs. However, as he explains this in his commentary, the highest, I quote here, the highest and most important authority in the state, so maximum et prestantissimus in the Republica, is that of the augurs, to whom it is accorded the great auctoritas. And this is the key point. It is to this priesthood that he then dedicates the largest section of his treatment, 13 lines in the Teubner edition against a total of 4 lines dedicated to the other priests. More importantly, he states that their use is maximum, so most likely what I think he means is in relation to the other priests. He seems to grant force of law to their informal pronouncements, and most strikingly of all, he grants the death penalty to anyone who does not follow their findings. Cicero says, "Whatever the augur shall declare to be unjust, unholy, pernicious, or ill-omened, shall be null and void, and whoever yields no obedience shall be put to death." Commenting on the augur's powers, Cicero lists, first of all, the power to adjourn popular assemblies, including those conveyed, Cicero specifies, by the highest magistrates, therefore the holders of imperium and potestas. He then lists the augur's power to declare null and void the decision of these very assemblies, so both the comitia and the concilia. He then moves on to list their power to interrupt and halt any business whose proceeding had already begun by simply crying "Alio die," another day. To bring home his point even more clearly, Cicero further asks the rhetorical questions. What power is more impressive than that of forcing the consuls to resign their office? What right is more sacred than that of giving or refusing permission to hold an assembly of the people or the plebs, or that of abrogating laws illegally passed? I suspect that there is here something more than Cicero's usual boastfulness or interest in advertising the College of Priests, which he had joined in 53 BC, although there is no doubt this is also part of the story. Got a second. The important point to emphasize is that in Cicero's account, the superiority of the augurs lie in their special connection with the notion of auctoritas. The beginning of his commentary on the augural provisions were prefaced by the explicit statement of this connection, "Jus augurum cum auctoritate conjunctum," and the list of their special prerogatives is so summarized. No act of any magistrate at home or in the field can have any validity for any person without their authority. As Federico reminded us, priests as well priestly colleges were holders of auctoritas. If in the De Domo Cicero emphasizes the auctoritas of the Pontifices, in the De Legibus he focuses instead on the auctoritas of the Augurs, which he portrays as superior to any other. In his recent excellent book, Gouverner avec le Dieu, Berthellet explores the special relation between the Augurs and auctoritas. Not only was there an etymological connection between the two, given of course by the verb augeo, so to augment, increase, but also they had a special relation with the ceremonies of the inauguratio, which distinguished them from the other priests, since they alone, alongside the Rex Sacrorum and the three Flamines Majores, so the flamen of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, were inaugurated before a popular assembly presided by the Pontifices Maximi. Most of all, however, the Augures were the only one who, in the words of Berthellet, had the power to confer actively, fully, and permanently auctoritas through the same ritual of inauguratio, be it of temples, peoples, or ceremonies. Their auctoritas was, so to speak, a full auctoritas, which derived from Jupiter, who, at the time of their inauguratio, had conferred upon them his own auctoritas. On the other hand, the other priests and senators were holders of a sort of secondary auctoritas, which they possessed as holders of concilium. The magistrates need to increase their potestas with auctoritas by taking the auspicia, which took place under the control, either direct or indirect, of the Augurs, as interpreters of Jupiter, or in the second place, under the control of the Senate. To remind you what Cicero had said, indeed, no act of any magistrate, at home or in the field, can have any validity for any person without their authority. Now, here, no doubt, the auctoritas of the Augurs is analyzed for its pivotal role within the Roman political system. As Cicero states at the very beginning of the laws on priesthood, and I quote, "The provision which follows really has to do with the condition of the state, as well as with religion." So they have to do with the statum civitatis, as well as with religion. Its object being that private worship may not be satisfactorily performed without the assistance of those in charge of public rights. However, the issue at stake is not so much that auctoritas is about political power. Rather, that the powers of the magistrates, their imperium and their potestas, should be always conceived and enacted within the framework of the religious auctoritas of the Augurs. The laws of the best form of government should ensure that the working of the state is, first of all, structured around religious approval. The language Cicero uses is revealing. The priests are required for the proper working of the state as, and I quote, "the people is always in need of the concilium and the auctoritas of the optimates," which in this case he really uses in a kind of a loose way. Now, of course, Cicero was not the only one who, in the late Republic, was thinking about the role of the Augurs, and more in generally of religion within the state. In the 1st century BC, we know that Fabius Maximus Servilianus had composed a work on religious law, Lucius Julius Caesar, a work entitled the Auguralis Libri, Appius Claudius Pulcher, a work on augural law, Valerius Messallas Rufus on the auspices, as well as Servatio Testas and Veranius. And it seems that even Cicero himself had composed a treatise entitled De Auspiciis. It seems that these texts, part of what McRae calls a civil theology, borrowed language and style from works on civil law to organize and codify Roman religious institutions and rituals into systems of knowledge. I think Claudio Moiti is right when stating that in response to a political crisis unfolding before their eyes, these intellectuals and engaged politicians began to systematize existing laws, selecting and ordering them, and in the process, I would add, establishing the principles of their very res publica. In trying to assess why Cicero altered, at least in emphasis, but in some crucial areas also in practice, the religious structures of his ideal commonwealth, it is important to consider the condition of political chaos and violence of the 50s in Rome. From the so-called First Triumvirate in 60 and the falling consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, 252 and the murder of Claudius and the consulship of Pompey sine collega, without a colleague, Rome was facing a situation of true chaos that ended up into a situation really of anarchy. No small part in the disruption of republican political life had been played by the use and abuse of the practice of obnuntiatio, and more generally auspicia. The most famous case that brought obnuntiatio to the fore took place in 59. This is a really very famous episode. Wishing to implement his first agrarian law, Caesar, faced by senatorial opposition, turned to the people. Bibulus attempted to block the procedure through obnuntiatio, but was faced with violence and forcibly expelled from the forum. His fasces were destroyed and he was covered in dirt. As a result, Bibulus locked himself up into his house, where he spent the rest of the remaining year, searching the heavens. However, Dio tells us that he did not announce the results of his spectio in person, but rather that he sent his lictors to do so. It was mainly in reaction to this episode, as Ferrari has shown us, that in 58 Claudius had passed the so-called Lex Claudia de Obnuntiatio, de Obnuntiatione, which, born out of this contingent event, was then to acquire a more generalizing dimension.